Greetings, everyone. Welcome to summer school and to the Hopin experience. Congratulations, you guys got in. It's the first challenge of the modern media era. I'm Jessica I almost said my maiden name. I'm tired today. I'm Jessica Lessin. Used to be Jessica Vassalero. And just wanted to kick things off by welcoming everyone. It's such an exciting time in the news business and such a challenging time. And we're really excited to spend some hours together to discuss what's happening and to try and be as useful as possible to so many of you who are excited about this industry. So thank you guys for being here. Very quick housekeeping. We'll be meeting Tuesdays and Thursdays at this time through July. Our format is going to be an hour-long talk with a special guest, and I'm very excited to introduce ours in a second. And there are a couple other attributes of the community and conversation. So if you haven't joined the Facebook group, please do that. So many of our speakers are going to be sharing materials that they're going to talk about or things that have been useful to them in their careers through that. So it's a wonderful place to also meet the many thousands of you who have registered for the program. So please do that and let us know. Email events@theinformation.com if you have any questions about the Facebook group. During the course of these chats, questions are also going to be key. So please fire away at any point in the conversation. We'll make sure to get to as many as possible. But please, send those firing in the chat part of the module on the right here. So we'll be monitoring those. And perhaps today, but we may start it next time. We're also going to have a sort of networking component after the conversations, and you'll be able to access that in the networking module on the left side. And what that's going to basically do is put you into a conversation with some other people. I think it works randomly. So if you're in mood for some random networking after we wrap up at the hour, that will be live. I'm going to confirm later on in the hour if that's going to be live today or if we're going to start that next week. So that was a lot of hullabaloo, but mostly thank you all for being here. And I think we have some wonderful conversations lined up this month. I'm thrilled to start with Ben Smith as the first one. I'm going to have Ben introduce himself and his life story. First of all, that is not your life story, but your journalism story. We'll note that he has pulled over to the side of the road to take, participate in this meeting, so we don't have to worry about a moving vehicle, or perhaps he's in an autonomous vehicle and then he's not driving. But it shows that in today's times, conversations can be had anywhere. But the reason we wanted to kick off our series with Ben is I can't think of a more successful reporter and editor who's really come of age and developed into what to me defines a truly excellent reporter and editor in 2020 and where the news business is. And Ben will get into this in his background, but I think really rode the internet and was of the first generation of reporters and editors to fully embrace it, to just do excellent journalism across all fronts. And obviously, having built Buzzfeed News and from nothing to the real powerhouse it is in the news business today, has a really important perspective on just building a newsroom and what he and others have been looking for in young talent. And now, of course, most recently, he's writing a column for the New York Times about the future of media, which I'm sure is already a must read for all of you as well. So with that, I'll step back. Take it away, Ben.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I see people in the chat noting that you didn't really introduce yourself.
Oh,
Jessica runs the information and founded it, which is it's just like the sort of premier business publication of the moment. But also, she sort of made a Freudian slip in which she mentioned her old byline, Jessica Vassalero. And like, if you sort of are interested in kind of Google stalking Jessica. Like, she was a killer reporter under that with that byline at the Wall Street Journal. And I feel like people who like sometimes people don't know that those of us who sort of somehow wound up in management actually once knew how to do journalism. Yeah. So So anyway, it's nice to the numbers. God, there are a lot of you on there. I can't see you, which is confusing. But I thought I'd just talk briefly about sort of I kind of grew up with reporting on the internet was growing up, which was a very interesting thing. And I think like maybe I'll talk about that a little in terms of kind of how I see reporting, really news gathering, which is my personal favorite thing and favorite part of this business. So I was, and it requires going back to when there were these things called blogs, which are like an ancient technology for publishing that is long forgotten and buried, but they were reverse chronological, web, as a publishing platform. And basically, like, I was a reporter for a couple of newspapers in New York at the beginning of my career, and reading a lot of blogs about the 2004 election and kind of wishing there was a New York political blog, and started one and got it up to like 3,000 readers, and it was incredible. And it was so easy to be relevant. Like, the mayor would have a press conference at like 11 a.m. and you would know that the New York Times wouldn't put its edition online until midnight. So anytime between 11 a.m. and midnight, if you decided to write up your notes from that press conference, you would be the only source for the like hundreds, not a lot of people, but for a bunch of people who actually needed to know what was going on. And so there was this moment when, and blogs at that point were sort of, essentially, it was a synonym for opinion. When I remember published this kind of expose on Rudy Giuliani, and he immediately dismissed me as a blogger, because that meant like you weren't really a journalist. You were kind of a wannabe columnist who like spent all their time yelling at the New York Times op-ed page. And so, and I think the thing that I saw, and a few people saw at the time, was you could take these tools that had been used for opinion and commentary and use them for reporting, and get into this kind of running dialogue with other bloggers, with your sources, and on the internet. And I did that for some New York publications, then went to Politico, which in some ways was a place that professionalized those tools and took things that had been felt like outsidery and just used the same technologies, just to be fast on the internet. Like, it again was sort of shockingly easy, and the places like the Washington Post were just shockingly slow to adapt. And so you could take a video of a press conference with your little handheld video camera, put it online, and the TV there would be 15 giant television cameras behind you, but none of them would have tape on air for hours and hours, if ever. And that's like the lowest form of journalism, just kind of racing people to put things on the internet. But it allowed these new digital players to be really central, to be a place that sources went, essentially. And for reporting purposes, you kind of get into a conversation with them and they start giving you scoops. And I guess that was sort of my path into that. And then by like 2011, you could just feel that Twitter had sucked all the life out of these blogs. There had been a dozen blogs that all, in politics, that are dozens really, fighting with each other all day and having kind of a running conversation that was a clumsier version of what you now see on Twitter. And as I sort of was realizing, like, all the action is on Twitter, and what I want to do is like break a big story and watch people react to it on Twitter, which I have to say I'm still shamefully like addicted to, like, pasting the URL of my story into Twitter and seeing what people are saying. Jonah Peretti, who was running Buzzfeed, approached me, and Buzzfeed was then, the world's leading cat website, in which, a position that I like fought hard to maintain when I was there. No shame in that. But also what it really was kind of an experimental laboratory for what people would share on social media. And what Jonah had seen was that one of those things increasingly was starting to be news. And so we went and basically took the sort of perspective of what if you assume that your audience opens Facebook and opens Twitter, doesn't open your website, on their desktop computer in the morning. And what's the job? And the job is to add to those platforms, to do something that'll break through on those platforms. And so what I told reporters when I hired them in 2012 is the front page of your website is twitter.com. If there's a story already on there, don't write it. It's already on there. You need to do new stuff all the time. Everything needs to break news, which was a lot of pressure and a lot of fun. The ecosystem has since gotten more complicated, but I still think often that, one way reporters use Twitter, obviously, to see what people are talking about, to get sources. But it used to be but the most useful thing about social media for me is still to sort of see what questions are being asked and aren't being answered, what questions you can answer with journalism, with reporting. And it used to be so easy. Like somebody would tweet, Israel, there was an Israeli strike in Syria, and somebody would tweet, I wonder what Hezbollah thinks. And there would be this whole conversation on Twitter about that. And it's like, well, like they have a spokesman. You can call him and ask him, and people didn't quite realize that. And there wasn't that connection. That's no longer true. The Hezbollah spokesman's now on Twitter himself. But I think that often on the most valuable thing you can do reporting on social media is to sort of understand what questions aren't being answered there and then go out and get the answers. And that's sort of how I think about it. So that's my very short and confusing version of the thing.
Awesome. I'm going to jump in with a couple of questions and we're going to go over to your questions. But I mean, Ben, you talked about, what was shockingly easy when you started.
Sorry.
Of finding opportunities to stand out in journalism. What's shockingly easy now? What's changed? Where's the untapped territory, particularly for people trying to get a break in the industry?
I don't know if I don't think there's a shortcut quite like that anymore. And I think the industry has changed a lot. I mean, I do, and I don't think anything is that. I don't think it's not an easy moment, as everyone knows. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that the thing that I've been surprised by is that people are finding a way to make a living in pretty narrow lanes. Like there's a woman named Lindsay Gibbs who has a newsletter about sexism in sports, and that's not like a small story, but it's not a story where there's a huge audience that wants to subscribe to a publication only covers that, and she's found an audience that does that. She's already an expert in it, but I think that particularly newsletters and Patreon and things like that allow you to develop. If you're a real expert and you're the dominant source in a pretty narrow lane, that's valuable. I mean, I still think that there's this trap on social media of just sort of surfing, being good at having conversations with people on Twitter. And, I think reporting basically isn't easy, but it's really fun. And there's not a lot of people doing it.
Yep.
Which is really, really aggressive reporting and trying to find stuff that other people haven't found.
What's your take on, and these are going to the questions, formal journalism education?
So this is an audience of people who are maybe thinking about going to journalism school?
Yes, it includes, I think, people at all stages, but focused on breaking in. Yeah,
I think I used to be a bit of like, I didn't go to journalism school, and I think I'm not sure it would make sense to take on a ton of debt to go to journalism school when you could probably get a crap job somewhere in the middle of the country where they pay you at least a pittance to do work and probably learn a lot. On the other hand, if somebody will pay you to do it, or if you can get, you certainly learn a lot, and you develop, and you get connections that some of us, like Jessica and I, in fact, like probably had the privilege of like having some of those connections. And I think that is one of the things that journalism school can really give you. But on the other hand, like really you learn so much just in some terrible low-level job, like making horrible mistakes. I was and like learning on the job. I mean, you really the way I learned to not screw up the spelling of people's names was when I was an intern at the Jewish Forward. I wrote a big story about a guy, and his last name was Gold, and somehow I thought his last name was Gross and used it in the whole story, which was like a lovely story about him, like misidentified him 47 different times, and I never did that again. And like better to make that mistake, and you can make that mistake in J school, or you can get some kind of, not very good job for a small publication and learn that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the ecosystem of feeder or entry-level publications has changed very sadly because a lot of places have gone out of business. So I don't know, when you were hiring a lot at Buzzfeed too, I mean, what were you seeing in terms of where were you hiring from? And were there some maybe less obvious backgrounds that might be interesting to people?
Yeah, we were hiring really from all over. I mean, I was trying to hire people who, the kind of ideal person for me was somebody who was killing it in their first job. Somebody who was in a job that was competitive and was breaking news and beating the competition, that could be at the Indianapolis Star, the sort of traditional path, like somebody who was a junior reporter at a newspaper. And we hired a bunch of people from, 2012 in particular, it was a very like chaotic moment. And we hired a lot of people from really, from student newspapers or from places that, who'd been great, been great on their undergrad newspaper and caused lots of trouble and gotten themselves, in real trouble with their administration I did notice early on at BuzzFeed that less than half the reporters had college degrees. We took the sort of college degree requirement out of the job listing. Because I think, but on the other hand, we also hired people, from Gawker Media, and we hired which was the sort of New York, blog world of the moment, and then we hired people from J schools, and the J school we probably hired most from was CUNY, which is a program I really like.
Mm-hmm. A couple of questions in here about newsletters. You mentioned the sort of rise of verticals and that you can build a real following on a fairly narrow topic. What do you make? Would you advise every new journalist to build a newsletter? You email out your columns to a small newsletter list. What's your take on that as a?
I think there are two different. I do really think beat reporters should be. I have two different kind of things on this. One is like if you're a beat reporter, which is basically what I am at the moment, you should be emailing all your stories to your sources and saying, hey, I just wrote this, as a way to prompt them to be like, oh, funny, you mentioned that you did a story on Netflix. Like, I know something about Netflix, and I hadn't thought to leak it to you, but now that you just emailed me, like, here it is. Mm-hmm. Sorry about the background noise. A very long train is going by. And then I do think that there is space if you are incredibly passionate about something, whether it's your neighborhood or town or community. The tools and the sort of people's willingness to pay online have hit a point where you can build a real, you can make a living, I think. Though probably not a killing in most cases, just like doing the work, like really important work of local journalism and getting really good at it and building that feedback loop. I think it's that is a really exciting thing right now. Mm-hmm. An old colleague of mine, Patrice Pack, just started a newsletter a few months ago on like the coronavirus and Black people, which is like, again, like it's really focused. She knows who she's talking to, and it's really good. And I think so I think if you are focused and you know what you're writing about, and it could be, a sort of cosmic subject like that, but it really could also be like, Leonia, New Jersey, and what's going on. You just need to stay super, super focused. Nobody wants a newsletter that's like, hey, like I'm writing features about all sorts of different stuff, and they're each good in their own way, but disconnected from each other. Like, your family probably wants that, but only.
Yeah. I've seen journalists feel pressure to just have a newsletter because or something. And I think, I always go back to like real reporting is really, really hard, and like, don't waste time doing things, more time sourcing, less time newslettering, I think is essential. And, but
the coin of the realm for people like me and Jessica, this isn't the only kind of journalism, but is scoops, is new information that nobody knew before, isn't like, particularly if you're kind of new to a subject, nobody really cares about your opinion on it. Like, you just got here, all these folks have been talking about it for a really long time. Like, and the way you integrate yourself into that conversation is that like these political activists or whatever other community have been talking about this forever, but like, hey, here you are with new information for them. And so they have to deal with you, even though you're some weirdo who they've never met before and like don't know what you're doing there.
Yep. It's a good formula. So there's a couple of questions, I think, in this bucket of like how journalists should confront so many of these bigger social issues and big questions like objectivity and Black Lives Matter, and just, the media is in the center of these, and often news coverage and scrutiny of news coverage is in the center of them. What advice do you have to journalists to engage? How to think about that, I guess, is maybe a good place to start trying to stitch together a couple questions.
Yeah, right. It's this incredibly kind of intense and, passionate moment in the country and divided. I guess I'm sort of a robot on some of this stuff. Like, I think that, like, particularly if you're a young reporter, like, really what you're seeing is what people care about. Like, people are so obsessed, rightly, right now with, like, police violence and what the hell is wrong with American police departments. And, if you have personal experience or like a reason that people should really care about, like, your opinion, sure, write that. But even if you do, and certainly if you don't, the thing you can add to that conversation is reporting. Like, what's going on in your campus police department? What's going on? Like, have there been shootings? Are there Freedom of Information Act requests you can file related to local law enforcement institutions that nobody's looking at, where you can get information that nobody else has? Like, I've always sort of viewed the really, really heated social conversations sort of as a cue to go and do reporting. It's not the only thing they are by any means. And there are these, I've been writing a lot about these sort of about the debates about objectivity. And I think I got kind of one of them started with this very talented reporter, Wes Lowry, who was kind of forced out of the Washington Post because his editor didn't like his tweets. But I also think that, there's a lot of straw men on Twitter, a lot of people yelling at straw men on Twitter. Like, if you got Wes Lowry and Marty Barron, his editor at the Washington Post, into a room and, like, gave them the same story to edit, it would probably come out more or less the same way. And their differences maybe aren't so much about or sometimes they're about journalism, but sometimes they're really about, like, values. Like, do you think this is a story? Do you think this is important? And so they're kind of, to some degree, those are generational, and it's not that they're not interesting, but that these shouting matches about abstract ideas like objectivity sometimes, are more light than heat. More heat than light.
Yeah. To dig into that a little bit deeper, we have a question like, what is your thought on reporting straight facts versus having, analysis as part of it? I think that's the question.
I think there's I think I kind of don't have I don't have an ideological point of view on it. There are lots of different publications. It's sort of necessary that the world is composed of different kinds of voices and approaches, and it always has been. And the sort of, like, super buttoned down journalists of the New York Times of old would sort of wait for the kind of rabble rousers of the partisan press to kind of drag a president's affair with an intern into the light, and then the Times could sort of debate whether you use the word blowjob in print, and, like, find a way to write about it. But there's always been an interplay between those things, and they're not. And I think you should choose the thing that you think you're best at and makes you most comfortable. I don't think it's I would say that, and this is something that I would say sort of in jest to people at Buzzfeed, but, like, unless there's really a reason that people should care about your opinion on a subject, like you're writing about what it's like to be a young person, or you're writing about your high school, you're writing about your experience with the police or something in your family, like, people aren't really going to care about your unqualified opinion about, agriculture. Like you shouldn't just like nobody's like. Well, a lot of what journalists do is develop expertise, and if you're, like, if you've been writing about things for a long time, you start to think, oh, I really know what I'm talking about. Often, like, in fact, I know more what I'm talking about than the so-called experts on my beat. And, like, you sort of can assert that expertise, but it's something you kind of earn. And I think, like, when you're ancient like me, you get to kind of rant, pretend to be an expert. But the best thing you can do as a reporter is really, like, this excuse to learn and kind of take yourself to school and call up the smartest people you can find on any beat. And it's like this weird excuse just to call up smart people and people who've had experiences and learn from them.
Yeah. And I just echo, I think that the impact and attention you can have by breaking news is just so much greater, particularly early in your career, but I think throughout your career, than
yeah.
And I think that, hopefully everyone in this call loves journalism and loves the reveal and that. And I think one of the silver linings to this, like, very tumultuous period in the news business, which really obviously predating the pandemic, but just to the shift in business model with the internet, is that, like, scoops and new information and impactful stories travel tremendously. And I think, there's so much of, I think there's a lot of headlines around people questioning if it's a good time to be in the business, but like you can just have such a tremendous impact with that. And, the challenge is there are moments when it's much, much easier to spout off some opinion or to try and wrap something in some kind of analysis. And that, not that there aren't excellent versions of that, but I worry, particularly when I see younger journalists who are leaning into that, I think more than, doing some of the hard work that is just so impactful. And so maybe we're both old school, but I just...
and I would say, like, I have this column in the New York Times that in some theory is supposed to be me, like, spouting my opinion for which I have, like, earned some credentials about journalism. And honestly, nobody cares. Like, if I'm just writing my opinion, nobody's going to read the thing. People are reading it because I am breaking news, and I'm like incredibly stressed every week about like getting scoops and putting them in that column, because particularly actually if I have ideas in there that I care about, I kind of know nobody's going to read them unless I have a scoop. And so I'm like totally obsessed with breaking news in the context of a column.
And giving
there's a couple of questions that if you don't mind, that I wanted to just
go for it. Go.
About teen journalists and high school journalism.
Yeah.
Which I have which I do think and it does run the risk of getting you in trouble, but like high school newspapers can be so powerful when you are writing and revealing things about your high school and things that like the administration maybe doesn't want you to know. And the Freedom of Information Act is an incredible tool with public schools. And high school journalism can be really boring when you're like practicing writing what you imagine a New York Times article would be like. And like, the opportunity in high school journalism, is to, also to review the student play, not Hamilton. But I think it's really uncomfortable in high school to be writing things that stress out the administration. But that's like a good, weird instinct to develop, because that never really stops in journalism, that like good stories kind of piss people off who you kind of, in some normal human sense, wouldn't want to piss off, and it's awkward. So like, I think if you can and also if you go, like your teachers will, like the good ones will kind of have grudging respect for the way in which you're a pain in the ass.
Yep. There are a bunch of questions too, just about COVID and the pandemic and changing the sort of job market. And actually, I mean, high schoolers might not be on campus come the next several months. I mean, what changes are you seeing in how, if any, how journalism is done, and does the current situation change your advice at all?
I mean, I think it's harder to get people's trust over Zoom. Like, I think that some of the sourcing stuff where, like, if you have a source who is really, it's something I've just been feeling, if you have a source who's really nervous about talking to you and you've never met in person, there's no real good substitute for meeting in person. And it's like, I mean, there's one thing in my head at the moment that I'm thinking about where it's like, there's somebody who I think would probably tell me some really interesting stuff, but we have never met. And like, I just think the idea that like, she's just going to like text me without having like, is a real problem, actually. I mean, I think it's isolating, and it makes it hard to get news sources. Everything is kind of easier to surveil. It's harder to be anonymous. All that all kind of makes me nervous. And I think the internal conversations of news organizations, it's harder to talk to people when you're not making eye contact, and you sort of see that all. It's and people are stressed out and tired and angry, and it's all sort of like understandable, but it's just adding to the pressure.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think on the margin, sometimes you run in with like, your source, the information. We do a lot of reporting around companies. I mean, we cover the business of the tech industry, and like our sources are available. You don't
totally
have to like duck out of Google's campus and hide in the bushes, right? Like they could pick up the phone and mute their meeting or whatever. So I think when you have an established relationship with a source,
people are bored and they want to leak stuff. Like that's the plus side. You have all these sources sitting around being bored, and like all their conversations are now like, it's so easy for them to record their Zoom calls. Like, I don't know. I hope if I've said something controversial, I hope one of you guys will like, or is this off the record, Jessica? I don't know.
I never on, I guess. Yeah. But please. leak that transcript.
I'm trying to be very careful. I don't want to talk about the New York Times, but but in any case, like, I would have no idea which of the 583 of you had leaked some sensitive piece of information or something, or recorded the thing. I mean, it's like, and I mean, this also is bad. It's bad if you're dealing with a very sensitive thing where you don't want to be surveilled. It's great if you're the surveillor.
Yeah, no, I think it's opening a lot of doors, and you've seen this. I mean, again, in the world of covering the big tech companies, pretty much every all hands meeting of a big tech company is now on Twitter, which you can debate whether it's good or bad, but it's certainly led to a lot of news and a lot of headlines. Gonna jump around a little bit. A couple of questions just about your kind of personal habits as a reporter. So questions about how you consume news, what you read, and also how you manage the stress of deadlines.
I mean, I'm on Twitter a lot. I read a lot of things from Twitter. I think Twitter sort of like rewired my brain in some fundamental way. I read the information, which I get on email. I read emails and Twitter, I guess. I don't do a lot of, there are a couple of like small, beautiful magazines that I read in print, and I read fiction in print, but yeah, mostly just kind of stuff kind of coming to me on the internet. Deadlines, I don't know. I like deadlines. I guess part of it is I do think like I'm really not precious about my copy. This, like, you're not writing for the ages. This stuff is, if you want to write something that's going to be read in 1,000 years, like, you're in the wrong business. And like, it's just not like Limoges juice is not that important here. And so, you find some piece of information, you write it down. If it's like, and honestly, if it's a good enough piece of information, you could like write it in crayon on a napkin and post the picture to Instagram, and like, who cares? It's a great scoop. And so, yeah, I think not being too precious and realizing that it's just a conversation. You're having a conversation with your audience. You shouldn't think of it as more permanent than the spoken word almost.
Yep. Good advice. Here's an interesting one. A lot of readers of your column, very specific questions about your columns. Could you walk us through your latest column about Netflix from the genesis to the final story?
Oh, you mean just how these things work?
Yeah.
It's funny because I sort of inherited this column. It was a column that David Carr really made, important in media, and Jim Rutenberg did a great job writing it after Carr. And I then stepped into it. And so I have a lot of sources. I talk to a lot of people, but there's also a community of people who've been reading that column forever and been sources of it forever, people I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And one of them is a Hollywood person who called me up and said, what's a really interesting column is how Netflix has, just like, I've heard from other Hollywood execs at other companies that they're frustrated how Netflix has this kind of deep pool of Black content and has really good instincts on social media and talking about Black Lives Matter, when all the other media companies, like many corporations, are kind of like paralyzed and panicked and maybe have produced a movie or two that are relevant, or have one Black show but don't have a real range. And this source was like, oh, and by the way, did you know that the like chief content officer of Netflix, that his father-in-law is this legendary figure known as the Black Godfather, and maybe that's really the story, which I think it wasn't in the end, but it just so it was just that was the prompt. And then like when you have a week, and honestly, like, I've never worked at the New York Times before, but this thing where you call people up and are like, hello, I'm from the New York Times. They just call you back immediately. Like, it's wild. It just makes it easier. So and particularly on their beats where I know a lot, like, about the news business. I don't really know a lot about streaming. I mean, I have and I didn't come in with a big Rolodex on the studios. So I just sort of asked this source and asked some other sources, cool, who would I talk to? And just started calling people and saying, I'm from the New York Times, you must talk to me. And like, it kind of works. Yeah.
Probably not so useful advice in people who don't work at the New York Times. And I've never.
No, and also, of course, it makes you incredibly lazy. And like, pretty soon I will like just be a totally useless, lazy reporter dependent on handouts.
Yeah. But it doesn't have to work that way. I mean, you were in the opposite. I mean, you were working at a publication that people thought it was laughable had a news publication.
Yeah, that was really fun.
And so, I mean, I think there's just so many questions in the feed about breaking in and standing out. And I think, we're both a testament to some ways, many, many, many other other people that it's just very possible to do through the work of journalism. And
through the reporting. And it's like better to be, I sort of see those questions in there too. And it is like, it is like being a real expert on something small is a really good way to break in. And that it also means that, you're not saying, hey, I'm calling from this publication you never heard of or my own newsletter to a different person every day. It's like you're working the same universe of people who are starting to be like, oh, I saw that she broke this story, and so I want to call her back. And reporting is a lot about kind of a community of people who are interested in your work. And they might hate you, and wish you weren't there, but they kind of have to deal with you because you are a source of information. And so, I think I definitely, like, my first gig was as an intern covering Jewish politics in New York, which is actually that's like a huge beat. You could have 10 reporters on that. But like, even particularly at the time, but like, I wouldn't ever worry almost about it being too narrow, because everybody has a couple good stories, and every beat, every place you can become the expert in and become relevant to the people there. And it's an incredibly useful discipline that once you sort of learn how to do it, it's pretty easy to transfer it to another area.
Yeah. Some of in terms of reporters that we've hired at The Information, we've hired one of our most amazing reporters, Corey Weinberg, was like a commercial real estate reporter for the San Francisco Business Times or something. And so he was covering like big commercial real estate deals, which was, it's actually a very competitive world in some ways, but it's a very specific thing. But he was just so consistently breaking news on it. And so I called him up and said, do you want to cover Facebook? And he had never thought about Facebook sort of as a beat, but, was extraordinarily successful in that beat, and broke most of the news about WeWork and the fall of Adam Newman and many other beats. And so, he can really, really stand out on a very specific thing.
And the hey, I'm from the New York Times thing is a nice cheat to open the door, which I've been here for a couple of months, but ultimately, like, you only get, it works once, right? Like if you're like the lazy, annoying reporter from the New York Times, they don't call you back anyway. And the really hungry person who is just relentless and calls a lot and is polite and is persistent is ultimately going to beat the New York Times reporter or the Wall Street Journal reporter. Yeah.
What's your take then on when you're reaching out to sources, like calling versus DMing versus like what is texting, email? Are you a phone guy or an electronic communications guy?
I tend to just like do all of them. Like, I'll send somebody a LinkedIn message, an email, a Facebook message, and a text and a signal, and call them all within like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Just so like they know you care.
Just so they know you got it covered. I think that's excellent advice. Here's a good question. With regards to the columns about Marty Baron and recent newsroom revolts, what is the balance between journalists' personal branding and public opinions and maintaining a staff narrative of objectivity?
I think it's a huge question and like a central tension in newsrooms right now. I think it's more generational than really like a profound matter of principle. Like, I think newsrooms have always had non-negotiable issues on which they didn't think there was they weren't going to cover segregation as an issue with two sides. And then like in the 10 years ago, kind of, I would say like LGBT equality sort of moved into that category. And then the sort of, so I think part of it is they're just cultural changes. Like, one of the big fights at the Washington Post that I covered, like, some of them felt like issues of real principle. One of them was about a story about a woman a great story a woman wrote about, like, getting high, about people were getting high and watching the musical Cats while high. Like, the editor hated that story, but like, that's just a story about like whether you like edibles, like that, like that dispute. That's not a dispute about journalism. The other sort of cross-cutting thing, right, is that social media has given journalists this ability to, to create their own spaces on the internet. And I think I was sort of able, when I was starting blogs, to like, I didn't feel like I was dependent ultimately on my employer, which was like the New York Daily News and other local places that don't exist anymore in New York. Like, I had sort of carved out my own space, and it changes your relationship to your employer, right? Like, journalists have always been kind of, in some sense, like more working for journalism and members of a journalism guild than they are just like normal employees of companies. But it changes the balance further and it pulls it more toward the individual journalist. And I think, some publications choose to not let people do that at all. And it means lots of talented people won't work there. And if you're going to allow, and it's sort of it's a complicated line. And again, I think to some degree a matter of that there are a lot of different ways to do it and a lot of different comfort levels. I mean, there are obviously trade-offs, but I also just think the world has changed and people are on social media. And, part of it is that like it used to be, you saw a byline and you didn't know if they were Black or Jewish or white. And often like the Times has this tradition of initials for bylines. Like A.M. Rosenthal was a great editor of the Times. A.H. Raskin was a legendary reporter. And they had those initials because they had Jewish names. And they didn't want it to seem like they had Jewish names. Or the Times didn't want it to seem like there were Jews writing for them or too many Jews, So like, and now that's obviously like disgusting in a number of ways. But also now, if you're interested in who a reporter is, you can go find their high school graduation photo and lots of other things. And so I don't really think that, I guess I'm uncomfortable with the idea that the aspiration is that you're this sort of faceless robot, because I think it implies that everybody has the same perspective or a dominant perspective. But even if that were your aspiration, it's not possible anymore.
And so in terms of advice to journalists who are trying to balance how much of their, how much to share on social media and how much to, how that could affect objectivity or not, what's your advice?
Yeah, I don't really know objectivity is a thing. You want to be really my impulse is, I guess I've always thought about it more tactically than ethically. Like if it's gonna, and there are different, like Glenn Greenwald got the biggest scoop of, one of the biggest scoops of the century because he was so clear. Everybody knew exactly what Glenn thought about surveillance and knew that Glenn would just like fight to the death for a source who came to him with secrets. And so Edward Snowden came to him. And that really works. I think for Maggie Haberman, who's published the most revelatory stuff out of the White House, I'm not sure I really know what she thinks. I'm not sure if me knowing what she thinks I don't know what she thinks, but maybe what she thinks would get in the way of her being able to publish these revelatory stories. And ultimately the goal is to publish the revelatory stories, not to like perform as a journalist, not to have people be like, wow, what a great human being even. And I think this is sort of a deeper challenge in journalism that there's a great essay by Janet Malcolm that you should all read about how essentially like every journalist is her claim is that every journalist is a con man and that like the core act of journalism is basically betrayal. It's a complicated business. And I think if your main goal is to have people, is to not cause conflict and not have people mad at you, it's a tough business. Yeah. Including your sources. Because sometimes maybe it makes sense to go to a source and have them and nod along while they say a bunch of outrageous things and not say like, sir, please stop talking. That's horrifically racist, because you want to get it into print and expose them. And your job is to do that. Yep. But other times it's really effective to argue with them and draw them out that way. Like, I don't think there's a single path at all. Yep. I
think it's treacherous. I mean, I think what you outlined makes a lot of sense. It just does sometimes seem treacherous because there's so much going on in this moment and so many factors at play. And I think it's hard to balance all the things you kind of talked about. Let's see. I'm just going to try and go through these because I think that these are all excellent questions. Yeah. Did you see any you wanted to jump on, Ben?
Go ahead. I mean, I see lots, but okay. Yeah. I'm very sensitive to the not being from the New York Times thing. I've only been from the New York Times for a couple of minutes, and
okay, so
it is just about persistence and knowing a lot. When you call somebody up and you really know who they are, and you're like, hey, I read your book, and there's this thing that's relevant to it that I'm interested in. That's really, really effective. When somebody calls you, when a reporter calls you and clearly doesn't really know what your deal is,
yeah,
like that's a real red flag to not reply.
Yeah. I always say, a source either puts down the phone or doesn't based on what you say, not who you are, right? Like if you confront them with something that they want to respond to or react to, they will. And you just kind of see that again and again. And so, again, it just comes back to the reporting, but you can basically, with good enough info, get a response out of anyone, pretty much, I think. And we'll post the Journalist Murder in the Facebook group so everyone can have it. Without belaboring the New York Times, BuzzFeed, there's a couple of questions just about like the cultural differences and how you experience that, but also like, what have you kind of learned about newsrooms that may be relevant to people as they're plotting kind of their careers?
I haven't learned that much about the Times newsroom because
you haven't been in.
Yeah. I mean, I do think,
I
haven't spent much time in big institutions that have been around for a long time and have these kind of institutional DNA, like BuzzFeed, which just kind of started and did what we wanted, and that was great. But at BuzzFeed also, there weren't these deep generational divides because most people were either of kind of my generation and younger, or were people who had like decided to affirmatively come to work for a place called Buzzfeed. So like, you were definitely not being tricked into thinking that you were working for like the Washington Post. Like, the thing is called BuzzFeed, and people were going to make fun of you. And so if that was like a problem, you wouldn't, go to work for BuzzFeed. I don't know. I think I love newsrooms. I miss being physically in one.
Yeah.
Sure, I don't think I have deep reviews.
Nice dodge.
There's a great, actually, Dean Baquet, the editor of the Times, did a very long interview with the Long Form podcast recently, and he talks about coming back from Columbia midway through maybe after his junior year, and walking into the newsroom of the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and just finding it this kind of like, and just totally feeling at home and falling in love with the place. And it's this bizarre batch of eccentrics who, it's unclear if they really welcome him, but like, he just feels totally at home among them. And it's pretty like, yeah, I mean, it's not exactly a collaborative environment always, but they're very interesting places.
Yep. Echo that. How do you get a source to go on the record who doesn't want to? Good question.
I mean, I think you just have to treat people with real respect. Like, first of all, there are lots of different ways, and maybe sometimes you trick them. I don't know. Like, there are lots of ways to do it, and I don't want to like. And again, like, the goal is to get the source on the record. That's a good goal, and there isn't just one way. Like, figure out what works best to get to that goal. I do think something that took me a long time to realize as a reporter is that your sources understand what's going on.
Yeah,
and you say to them, you should go on the record because this is really important. And I know it's going to, I mean, if it's a story, I'm working on a story about like a sort of thing that, bad things that are happening to people in a company. And it's like, it's not like I'm going to tell this source, it's going to be great. You're going to be on the record criticizing your boss and they're going to love you more the next day. You say, I think this is really important. I'll treat what you say with a lot of respect. It'll probably cause a headache for you, honestly, but I hope that you'll be proud of it and think it's worth it, and I think, and here's how I'll use it. But ultimately I can't really control the reaction to it. And this could be a real problem for you, but I hope you'll do it because you think it's important. And I think that's something that took me a long time to realize, that like, we have a lot of power, and, in a local newspaper, a local blog has a lot of power, and people take it really seriously. People take being written about really seriously. People who don't get written about a lot take being written about very, very seriously. And, you should take it seriously too, and they appreciate when you do. Yep.
I think it's interesting. I mean, people always ask me, how do you trick people into talking to you? And I mean, journalists always call them that. I mean, I'm just always amazed. These are can be very mutual relationships. I mean, people know exactly what they're saying and why, and being very upfront can go a long way. I also would just put another plug for like getting people on the record. I think, the world is full of anonymous sources, and we use a ton of them, and sometimes you have to, but there's no substitute for just the credibility you have and the impact you have. And several years ago, we were reporting on sexual harassment in Silicon Valley, and there had been plenty of Medium posts, and kind of it was in the air. But it wasn't until we got 3 women on the record about a venture capitalist named Justin Colbeck that the story like went to the next level and prompted a major reaction. And we even, I've been criticized often because the story was like fairly straightforward. It was just facts. It wasn't dressed up in a lot of language, but the people were on the record, and it just made a world of difference. And it can be very easy to kind of, I'm often dismayed, like how, and I fall into this too, but as journalists, like you instantly default to letting the person be off the record, and then you think you'll get them in. But I think we have to work very hard to, have people put their name behind things, and it is worth it. And it can seem impossible, but you also never know if you don't ask, which I don't think is happening enough. Okay, in 5 minutes or so, let's bang through the request for a Slack. No, it's fine. We'll follow up on various communication channels. A couple of questions just around how you deal with criticism and feedback. I think there's a lot of public backlash to everything right now. So I think this is a good topic for people.
Yeah, I guess I think partly because I came up in this sort of very unregulated world of blogs with people writing mean things, and it's in politics where people are awful. I guess I've sort of appreciate good faith criticism, and even often bad faith criticism. Like, I think you usually learn from it. I think there's a new kind of criticism which is really well organized and targeted harassment, which is different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was, at least from my part, I feel like I was a little slow to realize that this was no longer an argument. This was people screaming at you, having decided on Discord that they were going to come scream at you. But by and large, I think it's really valuable. I think Twitter, like, people who have differences with you or who think you're awful on Twitter, like, often have a point, and it's worth listening to them and trying to and kind of engaging them. And the goal of journalism, ultimately isn't to yourself perform. Just sort of, like, it always makes me uncomfortable when people in these days, in the sort of Trump era, will say to you, you say you're a journalist, and they say, like, well, thank you for what you do. Like you're an ICU nurse. Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's a complicated, messy job, and not all of it is stuff that you would necessarily feel great about the process of. And I think, like, there are things about journalism that are really more ambiguous. There are moments when you publish stories and you really don't know what the consequences are going to be, and you can't really guess, and sometimes they're bad. And so, like, you sort of have to live with all that stuff. And sometimes it's going to cause criticism. And also, it's just this incredibly divided country where, the media has become a symbol of things and criticize you for many dumb reasons as well.
Yeah. What work are you most proud of that you've done in your career to date? Not to imply it's over.
I guess the thing I don't want to put up a list of stories, like, it's most, most stories are incomprehensible like a year after they've been written because they're so pegged to the moment. A story that I've been thinking about lately that I wrote, that I'll toss in here just because I think it's, about being a young journalist and thinking you knew more than you did and getting everything wrong and realizing later, is something I wrote recently that I think is certainly true for me. I don't know. I think the thing I'm certainly proudest of, though, was sort of building this newsroom at Buzzfeed and hiring and championing a bunch of really great reporters.
We circled it a bit, but we're getting more questions about this sort of, like, how do you break in first jobs, particularly as there aren't open positions, and we've talked a lot about breaking news. Can you do that without a institution behind you? I just want to circle back on that, as it seems very top of mind for people.
I think it's really hard. Like, I don't want to be glib about how much harder it is to start out now than it used to be. I think the one thing I would say is that if you have a choice between a job where you're working in a big institution getting coffee for people, like if you're getting coffee for people at Condé Nast, or if you are, like the breaking news intern at, like, Black Enterprise, which an old colleague of mine was, like, take the breaking news intern job. It's, and even if all you're learning is to write really fast, like the jobs where you have some, like, tie to journalism are, to me, from my perspective at least, I don't think everybody would agree with this, but those are better jobs than the jobs where you're sort of adjacent to journalism in an institution that does journalism, but really getting coffee.
Yeah. I mean, I'd hire a reporter who came to me with like a good story, who like had zero background in anything or an institution behind him, but like had a credible path to like, I mean, I'd give that reporter a shot without, if they had something that they were sinking their teeth into. So I think it's just really about trying to think like a journalist, and that gets a lot of attention. I guess since we're wrapping up, and early on there were some questions just about like how you think, like how is the news business going to look way different 5 years from now, 10 years from now, maybe bringing our, the tech companies into a little bit. I don't know, just like zoom way out for us and give us some prognosticating.
I mean, I think on one hand, like the biggest institutions in the U.S., the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, are like getting stronger, not weaker, and consolidating, and then. But I think also you're seeing these kind of like a wider diversity of small places that are becoming financially viable and are going to be able to hire people. And a lot of the middle, which is say Metro newspapers, is being kind of hollowed out, which is where most of the jobs were. Like, I don't know. I think it's hard to imagine there aren't fewer rather than more journalists. Yeah, I think there are probably fewer journalists in this country and elsewhere in 5 or 10 years than there are now. Although there are more outlets and there are a lot of, hopefully there's some great smaller outlets starting to fill in, but just the raw number of jobs lost is so crazy.
Yeah. I'm maybe a little more optimistic, but I think there's a lot of...
the information will be around. That's a good place.
Yeah, well...
And I do think, like, I mean, I wonder what you think about this, Jess. Like, I think right now in Silicon Valley, there's this, profound, there's this idea that that kind of journalism is just another kind of, the New York Times, another institution to be disrupted the way Amazon the way Netflix disrupted Blockbuster. And, people and people who didn't used to have much power because they were suddenly find themselves with massive power and being covered like they're people with massive power, and they hate it because it's really adversarial and unpleasant. And they don't sort of realize that it's part of the deal.
Yeah.
And this is something sort of venture capitalists in particular. And they have this, and I think there's sort of an ideology developing there of like, could we fund or in some way build a kind of like different kind of journalism, that doesn't bother us and serves our interests, although they wouldn't put it that way. I think they keep finding it harder to do that than it sounds, because they really often have not looked into at all like how this stuff works. But I think there's, I don't know, that either really horrible things or unexpectedly good things could come out of that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think the relationship between the news business and the tech companies is, or just tech power, and right, some people who, you have Bezos buying the Washington Post, right? So that's a great example, I think, of where there is a different kind of synergy. I'm with you. I think you're always going to see attempts to fundamentally disrupt reporting, and I've engaged in a Twitter debate over whether what we do can be on the blockchain and many other things. And I think it's very different. And I see it as you framed it initially, as this sort of tech mentality of thinking that everything can be disrupted. And of course, technology will change journalism fundamentally, and has, but I don't think in the kind of formulas that some of the tech leaders kind of see. And if anything, I think some of the sort of sparring between tech people and news now is because news is still kind of asserting its tremendous power in many ways, and in ways that are that are frustrating. So I've always seen like the tech changes the platform and it changes the distribution, but I think it can create a tremendous number of opportunities. But who knows? I think to the more insidious ways it affects is it changes things like trust of readers, and it changes just how I think readers interact with the news and what people consume, and things like misinformation, fake news, all of that I think is a much much more worrying trends to kind of think about than, coming at the business directly.
And just one thing that I'm just noticing in the chat that I just as a coda to that, I think one thing that the tech companies and journalists, particularly outside the U.S., are realizing is that governments are reasserting themselves. And in the U.S., journalism is, sort of a spur to government action on the margins. But in lots of other countries, you see governments, broadly arresting, threatening journalists, shutting down platforms, and I think that's and I don't think there's an easy solution. There's no quick, easy solution to that, particularly when the U.S. government won't stand up, is no longer standing up for journalists overseas.
Yeah. So we'll end day one on that incredibly optimistic note. But Ben, thank you so much for your time. Little reminder, housekeeping to people, and Ben, ditch us if you have to because you're in a car. So for those folks who want to hang around now, if you refresh your browser and click on networking in the lower left, we'll have some networking. If you just want to chit chat and say hello to someone, this is a wonderful group, and I think there are fabulous opportunities to meet each other. So please do that. Otherwise, we'll keep the conversation going in Facebook, share some of those links. I saw the request for a Slack channel. I think it's 50-50, like we've done those for events and people wanted Facebook groups, but again, we'll see what we can do because I think the discussion and community is a wonderful part of this. On Thursday, I should say for those of you who weren't in the beginning or didn't introduce myself, I am Jessica, the founder of the information. So you'll see me throughout many of these calls, not all of them. So it's another reason that some of you were kind enough to ask me questions. You'll hear more from me, so don't worry about that. I wanted to give our awesome speakers the kind of microphone. And on Thursday, I'm very excited. We've got going in a very different direction into the world of the future of magazines. Two fabulous leaders from Fast Company who really reinvented the magazine in the digital age. And I know they have a great presentation, a little more sort of tactical, couple slides, that kind of thing. But hopefully we'll see many of you, tune back on Thursday and we'll wind through various topics, but please send us your feedback too. And again, the Facebook group's a great way to do that. We want to make these sessions as useful. We know everyone's time is valuable. Lastly too, as a thank you or as part of being this too, I want to make sure you guys keep an eye out. We have comped you all subscriptions to the information, which for those of you who don't know, hopefully you know, but a publication I started about 7 years ago. We cover the business of technology, and it's a premium product over $400 a year. But we wanted to, widen the community, get feedback from you all. So if you're interested, check out your email. We've comped the subscription on us, and we'd love your feedback as well. So. With that, I know we're spanning so many time zones. I don't know whether to sign off with good evening or good morning or whatever it is. But thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I did. And we'll see you again soon. Have a good one.